In the preceding program, you heard how the elements of sonata form were put together. The first subject group, with its particularly active musical gesture, its clearly recognizable idea, the recognition of which by you, the listener, helps orient you in the process of time passing called the sonata form movement. You heard the shorter, contrasting second subject group ideas, and then the closing group gathering up the first and second group ideas and musical types. You heard then the demarcation point, the silence. You heard how the classical equilibrium was maintained by the return of this material, the return of that which was exposed, hence its initial presentation, the exposition, its balancing presentation, the recapitulation. You also heard a shorter section, which we referred to as an excursion, using the material in various ways from the exposition. This excursion, popularly known as the development section. We also said, however, that any good model is only that the model of the masters lives only when that model serves its master. And last time you heard how Beethoven, with that vigor and with that dynamism and the ability to give drama inside the form, made living, as we said, almost human in terms of psychological drama, human situations in the music. No better example of how a model can serve masters of different musical temperaments and stylistic personalities than contrasting two movements by masters who are normally twinned. That is, the great masters of Viennese classicism of the 18th century, Mozart and Haydn. And although in our popular history text they are twinned, like Bach and Handel are twinned for the Baroque, nevertheless, they're very different musical and indeed personal responses to life and to art can be heard in the way they handled the content of their model. When you listen to the first movement of a Mozart work, you will find the form constant, but we have tried to show you that what you are listening to is a series of little patterns, a series of graces, as it were. You would hear an active part followed by a passive part. Each of the sections, first subject group, second subject group, is a package in which are collected a sequence of these contrasting little ideas. You will hear at the beginning of the sonata, which will be played shortly, a lyric idea, gentle, swaying, followed by a graceful, minuet-like idea. This sort of contrasts setting up then for what will come. There is the demarcation point. The initial idea in the pattern of the second subject group is different from the initial idea at the beginning of the movement, so that Mozart does preserve the idea of contrast between first group and second subject group. In this case, the lyric idea will be contrasted with a lighter, sprightly type of dance. Then you will hear lots of action, almost prophesying Beethoven in some of the drama that you'll be hearing in that movement. But the music of Mozart justifies the use of the term subject group rather than first theme, second theme, as we're more accustomed to in talking about 19th century Romanticism, because they are indeed groups of little ideas, which in their variety and in their complexity making up the whole are, in effect, musical mosaics. We are familiar, of course, with the mosaic through the inheritance of classical and immediately post-classical art, the ability to create the overall impression, the design from small fragments. The face which you are seeing being but one example of this art left to us as an inheritance, particularly accessible in the examples from Roman Britain. And in these mosaics, such as our design in front of you now, you see not only subject matter, the animal, but also look at the rhythm, look at the patterns repeating in the lower design there. The repetition of these patterns giving the flow to the eye, even as the variety of content in a Mozart work gives flow to the music. Once again, as in the classical arch that we commented upon before, we have a corollary between the art of music, which is structured sound, and the visual arts, in which materials are patterned, structured for the pleasure of our eye. Throughout the history of man, the artist and artisan, the mosaic and related patterns have been principal devices in certain of our cultures. For example, Persian prayer carpets are another corollary to the Mozart music, in which the overall impression is made up of small curling graces. And it is the grace of Mozart's ideas that are such a pleasure in his musical content. In our Western culture, the high Gothic stained glass window is perhaps most familiar to us. Here again, clear, bold design, well articulated, just like sonata form, but the content made up of variated color, various little patterns to give an exciting whole. And so when you listen to the work which we're about to hear, catch that idea in mind as the main principle of appreciating the way Mozart filled his form. The first movement of a sonata in F major by Mozart. Once again, as in the preceding program, we tried to show you through the use of photographs as well as shots of the live performer, we tried to show you the articulation of the form. And perhaps you recognized that the entire development section, which for Mozart is relatively short, that was pictured for you by that delightful painting of the Mozart family, Leopold Mozart on violin and little Wolfgang at the keyboard. A musical mosaic for Mozart. Something quite different, though, for the typical movements of Haydn. And we've tried to show that to you here by using a design that has grace. It couldn't possibly be Viennese classicism unless it had that little extra turn, that little extra smoothness to the contours that mark the gracefulness, the gentility of even the most active of musical ideas of Haydn and Mozart. But you will notice that this forceful turn is put in the service of action, of repetition. And the force and the drive of this music that is sending your eye along our model is just that. The rhythm of the individual idea repeated again and again and again and driving to the final demarcation point. Notice too that in our development section there is nothing else except the contour and thrust of that initial idea. And what we've tried to show you in visual rhythms, you will be able to hear in audible rhythms later on. The fact that one of the chief characteristics of Haydn's musical style, and one which tends to contrast him to Mozart, is that instead of setting up a musical mosaic of ideas which contrast among themselves, Haydn realizes the form and a series of motifs that are related to each other by their rhythmic power and identity. It was this, of course, that Beethoven would pick up and develop into that intense, forceful material which would drive music ultimately into the power of 19th century Romanticism. Haydn tends to set up, right at the beginning of the work, a very forceful rhythmic gesture. In the case of the D major sonata, which we're going to hear shortly, yum pop 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 tilyum tilyum yum pop 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 tilya tilya, and everything after that somehow is derived from it. You will hear in the development section the idea itself. Yum pum 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 tilyum tilyum digga 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 dum pum 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 yum pum 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 tilya tilya. That's plain enough, and you will hear that marking out the beginning of the development section. But everything else that is contained in the exposition somehow is traceable back to that initial rhythmic gesture. It is the beginning of a type of almost an atomic process in music, which, as I said, Beethoven would make his own. Haydn can carve up that idea, yum pum 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 tilly bum tilly bum, so that some of the subsequent ideas are simply the repeated note, ta 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 ta. Sometimes it is just a turn, tilya tilya. Sometimes he can combine these two ideas, the repeated note and the turn, in different ways, so that the closing figure, yum pum tilyum pum pum tilyum dun 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 dun, is a fresh combination of the repeated light ta-ta and the very strong ornament ta-ya. So from yum pum 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 pa-ya pa-ya, you get ta-ta-ta-ya, ta-ta-ta-ya, from aggression to grace, and yet all part of a very tight intellectual process. The second subject group, again demarked from the first by silence, at first sounds quite new. Da-da-da-da-dum, 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 da-da-da-da-dum. But that is simply a stretching out of an ornament. Da-yum, da-yum becomes da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. And very soon we hear again the initial rhythmic force. Pop, 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 pop. So we get da-da-da-da-dum, 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 yum, pop, 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 da-da-da-da-dum, yum, pop, pop, pop. And again, combinations, stretchings, telescopings of what was in that kernel, that exciting initial gesture at the beginning of this work. There is, as I said, nothing fresh in the development, but the development meant something different for Haydn than it did for Mozart. Mozart would learn this from Haydn, and we hear it in his later works. that rather than being a graceful diversion and taking something recognizable and very gently spinning it through and wandering through other keys, here we have forceful combinations and recombinations of that initial rhythmic type, so that the entire movement as a whole is unified by the initial idea. This too has its corollaries in art of the 18th century, and there's a very lovely example that is still existing in England today. It's in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it lies in the area of the decorative arts. You see a picture of an interior design, and as you are looking at this, you can see that although we have the grace and the turn typical of the early 18th century, nevertheless there is a rhythmic forcefulness to that which is repeated not only within the design, but also as you multiply that design across the room. Now, if we then look at the room as a whole, which is the music room from Norfolk House, you will see this rhythm, as it were, exploded all over the room. You find it in its initial rhythm. You find it repeated in different guises until you find yourself caught up in that rhythm, multiplied again and again, sometimes expanded, sometimes contracted. The artist is clever enough to place within the room mirrors so that the multiplication continues. And so the rhythm for the eye, like the rhythmic motif in the Haydn sonata, drives us forward. It fills the architectural spaces and allows us to gain texture and perspective, and at the same time enjoy that content. Now, what we're going to do is to have a performance of a complete Haydn sonata movement, a sonata in D major, and when Lynn Stodola plays it, you'll be able, I hope, to trace not only the individual components of our model, but also feel the unity that Haydn is able to bring to this. Instead of Mozart's variety and contrast, then, the inner rhythms, the strengths and the drives of the Haydn work. And what Haydn sets up will then continue into the mainstream of music, taking us right down into indeed the beginning of 20th century Romanticism. Here then, the second half of our contrasting pair, as the model serves its master for the musical personality of Franz Joseph Haydn.